Welcome back to Sweet Sycamore, episode 19, as we go through chapter 10. Now, I'm not going to go through 2 podcasts with 1 chapter here in just the short chapter 10 with only 3 verses. So our 20th episode, our next episode, will be summarizing all the amazing lessons that we have learned in the book of Esther. But today we are going to go through this massive chapter of chapter 10. And it's as simple as this. It says in verse 1, King Xerxes imposed a tribute throughout his empire, even to the distant coastlands. His great achievements and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Media and Persia. Mordecai the Jew became the prime minister with authority next to that of the King Xerxes himself. He was very great among the Jews who held him in high esteem because he continued to work for the good of his people and to speak up for the welfare of all of their descendants. I find it interesting that we start off the bat with King Xerxes imposed a tribute. Do you guys know what a tribute is? A tribute is a tax. Okay, so where we left off in chapter 9, everybody is celebrating, not only the Jewish people, although it's actually made kind of like a law for the Jewish people to celebrate this festival of Purim, that their lives were saved. It's like a big, massive party in Persia for what God had done. They are partying hard. And King Xerxes is like, yes, isn't this great? Let's impose a tax. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but if any of my officials were like, this is amazing, let's take money, let's take an offering like that you have to pay or else. I'm like, that to me just kind of dampened the mood of the celebration, for sure. Do you remember in Esther 1 when it really went through the wealth of King Xerxes at this party and how it spoke about the golden couches? First of all, that would not be my choice to go sit and relax on, but it makes you really realize how wealthy this king is. And here he is imposing a tax when the people are celebrating what God had done to make sure that people are remembering who he is. And I look at that and go, come on, King Xerxes, couldn't you just melt down one of your couches if you really wanted more money? It wasn't about the money. It was about making sure that the attention was still on him and not solely on God. And so you actually see that King Xerxes himself is still all about himself. He's been doing this from the beginning, and he is still sitting there, and he has not learned a lesson. We see that Mordecai and Esther have learned lessons and really surrendering to God and being proud of being children of God. But King Xerxes has learned nothing throughout this whole thing. Do you ever have those stories in life where you feel like God had just done something so big for you, but the people who probably needed it most, who needed that cage, that golden cage kind of rattled, the come to Jesus moments, are still walking away, not learning any lesson? Oh, I've had that happen so many times in my life, and it's so frustrating. And going, Lord, I just saw you in a big way. How did they miss you in the same moment? You see, the reason is because although God showed his hand, the game was not finished. And my friends, the game is still not finished. Until we actually have the coming of Christ, until we have the tribulation, all of these things, whatever you believe within that area of Revelations, until we have that second coming of Christ, I will tell you, it's not finished. God is still working, and you are always going to have people completely missing him, even when God just showed a winning hand. That's just part of it. There will always be people missing God because they're not looking for God. And when you're not looking for God, it's so easy to miss him. It's so easy just to give it to chance or to give it to luck or simply just to ignore it. And for us on the other side who feel like we have seen God in such a massive way, like these Israelites have felt, this entire group of Jewish people in Persia, it's so frustrating for people to miss it. And it's also frustrating for evil to still be evil, even after you have seen God's hand in a big way. And just probably even ask, like, Lord, why can't you just take it out? Why did you just fix it, like, temporarily? Why couldn't you just take out the evil? My friends, I'm going to tell you, he will. It says in the scriptures that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is Lord. There will come a point when he wins. It will happen. But until that moment, the game is still getting played. And there's going to be a lot of moments in our own story where it looks like evil is winning. Maybe those moments where then all of a sudden you see God, but then evil just sticks its head up so fast, even after you have seen the Lord. And those moments we have to trust and know that this was just a little play in a big game. But we know how the end of the game is finished. And we have to be able to sit in that and have peace, even when we see a God victory, but so fast it looks like it's being turned around. I remember over a decade ago, my husband and I were in a situation that was really wearing on us. It dominated all of our conversations, wondering what God was going to do in the moment. And it was really hard. And we finally, after 2 years into this predicament, got some good news. And I could see God. Like I finally was like, oh, this is what you're doing. And I thought that this was going to be like the final outcome of this situation. And so my husband went to work that Saturday, and I just was just giddy with excitement with what God was doing. And I danced. I mean, my background is in dance, but I was like, I wanted to like praise dance. And I just danced like David danced before the Lord for a good 2 hours in our living room. I mean, my body hurt afterwards, but I just was so excited that God looked like he was finally going to really move. On that Monday, I found out that what I thought was going to be really wasn't going to be. And I remember going before the Lord and being like, oh, Lord, you let me look like such a fool. Like you knew that really wasn't the case. And yet you still like let me think that and do that. And oh man, did God get a hold of my heart? I was like, no, Nikki, you were exactly doing what you were supposed to be doing. In fact, you should praise me, whether you think things are going to be good or whether you think things are going to be bad. You should still continue to praise me like that. And I'm going to be honest, I really took that as God kind of got a hold of my heart of like, no, I'm not going to go back and be depressed or be sad. I'm going to live in that moment of just rejoicing before God and just live in that and just start praising him even when things aren't good. And I'm going to tell you what, it was another year later. But we did see God move in such a miraculous, crazy way that here a decade later, we still talk about this God story that happened. And I do believe that part of it was praising him in moments when we really didn't have anything to praise about, and probably praising him in the moments we thought we did and then we didn't, but it didn't matter. Being still proud that we praised him and not being discouraged. Evil is still going to exist, and it's still going to rear its ugly head. It's still going to make us frustrated. We're still going to go through things, but do we choose to praise him in the middle of the storm, whether things are good or bad? I would like to think that even Esther and Mordecai would continue to praise God in all that he had done for their people, even though King Xerxes is still King Xerxes. Yes, we need a major overhaul. We would love to take sin and take ugly people and just take them out. There will come a day when God will get his final judgment on all things. Until then, we just have to keep looking for the hand of God and focusing on the hand of God, even when we feel like it seems so short-lived because evil just keeps popping up. But we can't stop celebrating. I often think of like the Puritans who refused to celebrate Christmas and Easter. They didn't do it because they hated celebrations, right? They did it because they felt like Christmas and Easter and celebrating things about God shouldn't be celebrated one day, but should be celebrated every day. That it's a massive celebration, that you actually live in celebration. I understand the thought, but I'm not sure if it actually works, because the reality of it is we just forget. If we don't remind ourselves to celebrate like Christmas and Easter, then days blend into other days and we just forget to celebrate. But I understand the concept. I understand that living a life where you are eternally grateful for all that Christ did for us, for the fact that he came to this earth a baby, the fact that he gave his life, and living a life of celebration. It should be something that's celebrated every day, kind of like with the Jewish people. It should be like every day is a festival of Purim because of what God did for them. And we see that God's hand is still on Mordecai and Esther, because this last portion of chapter 10 tells us that Mordecai is still receiving favor. Now we need to remember that Mordecai is still human. And what happens when most humans get into power? Oftentimes, corruption follows. But that's not what we're seeing with Mordecai. In fact, we're actually seeing that he was highly respected and held in high esteem as he worked for the good of the people. It shows me that Mordecai himself still walked humbly. Remember that man who just stood by the gates, even when he got ushered around the city, he went back to the city gates. Mordecai lives a very humble life, and we're seeing that continues even when he steps into one of the highest places of authority that he could possibly step into outside of being the king himself. He is still fighting for the underdog. And I look at this and I think, what a beautiful lesson to learn from the life of Mordecai, to constantly live a life of humility. I mean, it says in the scriptures that blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the kingdom of God. I look at this and I think, well, it seems pretty perfect for Mordecai. He is walking in meekness, and we saw that in Esther's life too. And that is getting them God's blessings, not something that they can earn by themselves or for themselves. And we actually see that this is not something that they have earned, but something that has been given to them strictly by the favor of God. And that's another way that they can look and see God's hand. That although King Xerxes may still be King Xerxes, they are still in a place that God put them in. I think there's another lesson to be learned right in this moment, that the evil will still be evil. It will still look like it's trying to take us out. But the position that you are in is still something that God ordains, that God puts you in. And so although it may look like you do not want to be where you are at, there's always that saying that you bloom where you are planted. I'm sure Mordecai had all the lap of luxury right at his fingertips, but it probably wasn't a fun job to be in that position. There was probably a huge amount of responsibility. Perhaps there were even moments when he was in this position that he thought, I wish I could just go back to sitting at the city gates and just doing my own thing when I wanted to do it, instead of this massive job that takes up all of my time. Perhaps he wondered, who are my friends? Since he's the second in command to the entire area of Persia, and everybody would want to be Mordecai's friend. Perhaps he just wished he could have lived this simple life, but God had big things in store for him. I think sometimes we just need to bloom where we're planted, and it may not look like we're living the lap of luxury like Mordecai had at his fingertips. Perhaps it's the simple life for us, but God has big purposes and intentions for what others may look like a simple life. Nothing is simple to God. He always has us where he has us for reason, purpose, and intention. And part of that is asking why. Who are the people that you want me to impact? Who are the people you want me to help fight for? Who are the people that you want me to help bring closer to you? And those are some of the questions we can ask God as we're trying to figure out how we bloom exactly where we're planted. But I want us to remember the very first thing we spoke about in some of the first podcasts was the reason they got themselves in this mess in the first place is because these Jewish people did not go back to Israel as God had called them to do so hundreds of years previously. They stayed, and that is why we're here. What are they doing right now? They are staying. I mean, part of me goes, wouldn't you just give it all up and say, yeah, but if I'm really going to be obedient to God, I need to go back. Now, could have God really laid on his heart to stay? Yeah, and we actually don't know. Like maybe he did, but he's not encouraging all the Jewish people to go back to Israel. He's encouraging them to have festivals, to say who God is, but still not to go back and do the first obedience towards God. I'm going to be honest. As we can pretty much guarantee that evil is going to still be evil, us as humans are still going to be human. We're not going to get things 100%. It didn't mean that God took his favor away from Mordecai, and I love that. We see that throughout this entire book. God is so patient with us in our partial obedience, and I'm so grateful for that. But we continue to see Mordecai do amazing things for God's people. And so we continue to see the favor of God on Mordecai. I find it interesting that chapter 10 ends with Mordecai. Although the book is called Esther, This book is so much about this man named Mordecai and the life that he lives and the way he fights for his people, but yet he seems so estranged towards God himself. He doesn't talk about God. He tries to do all of the things that are right before God, but doesn't seem to know exactly how to do it correctly. And I can relate to this man. I can relate to this man of trying to do the best that he can with what he has and God honoring him for that. I think that teaches us a lesson as we sum up this book, as we end it here in chapter 10, that God's hand was on both Esther and Mordecai as they tried to figure out how to do it. Oftentimes, we can spend weeks and months and possibly even years holding off on action because we want to do it perfectly. When God says, just step forward and I will teach you each step of the way. I will cover the bases as you step out for me on behalf of me. Esther and Mordecai, they stepped out. And because they stepped out, we get the end of this book with them right beside King Xerxes, fighting for the underdogs, fighting for the people, being highly esteemed in a massive, massive area of land because they stepped out, not because they had the answers. Each step of the way, they had no idea what was going to happen next because it was all about God and it was all about God showing up. And to be honest, each step of the way had to be God because they had no authority on their own. And so when I see this, I have to look at this and go, Lord, you know what? It's not about me figuring out all the right answers before I step out. It's about the step. This whole thing makes me think of the Indiana Jones movie in The Last Crusade, where Indiana is in front of this massive kind of trench and he's trying to get to the other side. And he's got this book of the clues he's kind of going through. And he says, only a leap from the lion's head will prove his worth. And then he says, it's impossible. No one can jump this. And then he says, oh, but it's a leap of faith. And when he steps out, when he takes that step, the stones automatically appear beneath his feet. That's so similar to what it was like for Mordecai and for Esther. And I believe what God is calling us to do. We just have to take the step. God will provide the footing. God knows the plans. He knew the positions that he was trying to raise Esther and Mordecai up into. They had to be the ones to accept. They had to be the ones to say yes to each step of the plan. And as they did, they found God's favor. The book is already written. God will use us or he will use somebody else. I believe if it wasn't for Esther and Mordecai, God would have used somebody else. But they said yes to all those very hard moments of stepping out. And God honored that. And here at the very end of the book, we see God's favor resting upon them. Chapter 10 is all about Mordecai. And as we wrap this up today, I want to draw attention to the first thing we learn about Mordecai in this book. And that is the fact he took on a child that wasn't his to raise, having no idea who she was going to become and together what they were going to do. This just tells me that God honored Mordecai for his faithfulness from the very beginning. We have a beautiful opportunity to be faithful in the small things. And as we are faithful with the small things, God will keep giving us more and more. Oftentimes people say, I just want the big story with God. I want that Mordecai ending. I want to see him in a huge way in my life. And I will take it all the way back to the basics and encourage them. And as I am encouraging you today, be faithful with the small. God honors those that are faithful with the little tiny things. When the scriptures tell us after he was paraded around with all the authority through town and he simply went and sat back at the city gates, that was in there for intention and purpose to show us that Mordecai was still faithful to who God had called him to be in that moment and did not allow that fame to go to his head. Be faithful with the little, and I promise you God will have bigger and bigger things in store for you. Well, that wraps up the book of Esther, but we will be back for episode 20 as we're going to pull out all the gems that exist in this book. Until then, have a great week, my friends, and we will be back next Wednesday with our Sweet Sycamore devotion.